No, looks like a very nice room that I'm paying for as a taxpayer. You have a good night at my expense.
This is my town and I was brought up here. It's not a hotel, it's a hotel for migrants.
We're being misdirected again by the establishment to concentrate on something other than the recession, austerity and the mismanagement of COVID-19. Sadly, there's so many grifters and even normal people who have been aiding the government, the Tory government, in scapegoating and misdirecting the attention towards migrant crossers. It's a smokescreen, my friends. If you can't see this, then you need to train your powers of discernment, otherwise you'll end up following grifters or being part of the Tory establishment propaganda machine. Why has attention been ushered in by the media and politicians onto the refugees all of a sudden, given the crisis the country is in right now? Ask yourself that question and then you'll realise it's a smokescreen. It's masking the mismanagement of COVID-19 by the Tory government. It's also masking the deepest recession that we've ever been in since records began, and perhaps most importantly is masking the unemployment. Unemployment is escalating by the month. It's only going to get worse. Grifters like Mr. Golding and Mr. Robinson and those attention seekers who go down to Dover with PayPal links and cameras just won't talk about this stuff because they are part of the misdirection. They are tools for the government right now. The asylum situation really is not as scandalous as it's being made out by simpletons and grifters and the media. The establishment must think you're stupid or that you just don't read, i.e. you're ill-informed. We're going to go through a few misconceptions. First off, why do we have refugees? Look at the research. You've got to go with the research. According to Oxford University, concerning 2018, the most common countries of nationalities for refugees included Iran, Iraq and Eritrea. We all know why Iraq is in the state that it is, and some of the Zio Civnats that you follow may well have been those who were warmongering back in the day, calling for war and invasion of Iraq. So this is downstream from those events. And as for Eritrea, Eritrea continually goes through economic and political power struggles in the region, so much so that nearly 500,000 people have been displaced in Eritrea. So 500,000 Eritreans have been displaced. As for Iran, we know who meddles in their affairs, and we know a bunch of Zio Civnats only in the last year were calling for strikes against Iran. Keep that in mind. The moral of the story here is do not destabilize or decimate other countries, and if you follow that rule, there'll be fewer refugees, I guarantee you of that. This is all downstream from Zio Civnat wars and policies in the Middle East and other agendas in Africa and beyond, which the Tory government are to this day supporting and actively involved in. So we know if you stop meddling in other nations' businesses, that means less refugees. Just to furnish this point with some more stats, again from Oxford University, the source states, and I quote, for example, the spike in people who came to the UK to seek asylum between 16 and 20 years before 2018, that is from 1998 to 2002, were mainly nationals of Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq and the former Yugoslavia, all sites of war, I unquote. To lend support to that idea that refugees are downstream from wars, we all know what happened to Syria, right? Let me tell you, 2/3 of resettled refugees in the UK are Syrian nationals. Think about that the next time a Zio Civnat is asking you to support a war in the Middle East or wherever. Switch your brain on and start asking questions.
You're part of an invasion into our country, Sadiq.
And secondly, we're not being invaded. Folks who use this word, invasion or invaded, they want you to think more emotionally rather than intellectually. That's why they use these buzzwords. On top of that, this idea that Britain is deluged by refugees. That's not true. It's just not true at all. Relatively speaking, we take in very few asylum applications. In 2019, it was only 49,000, and I use that word only in a comparative term because let's compare it with Germany. 165,600 refugees were taken in, or asylum applications rather, in 2019, compared with our 49,000. Then France, it's 129,000. Spain, 118,000. As for this claim that only European countries take in refugees, again, that's just not true. The fact is, the vast majority of the world's refugees, 84% of them, are located in developing nations. Thirdly, the emotions around the hotels are being taken advantage of.
Good night at my expense. We're all British taxpayers, yeah? So we're paying for your nice room there.
Okay, now in Britain, the way we see hotels is we see them as luxury places for people to stay. For people who are quite well off, they stay in hotels, right? So it gets people worked up, it gets them agitated, knowing that they're being used to house refugees. They're never agitated when politicians and others use them at taxpayers' expenses, or when folks like Prince Andrew and other royal family members get funded by the taxpayers' cash. Can you imagine if Prince Andrew was a Muslim? The Zio grifters would have you outside his residence protesting day and night. Keep that in mind. That's the way this hypocrisy works. Why is everybody so silent on Prince Andrew? Circling back to the hotels and the refugees, hotels are being used as holding areas as they've been shut down due to COVID-19. The hoteliers are the ones who are profiteering from all this. Keep that in mind. These are simply being used as temporary holding areas because the hotels are currently empty. The refugees are not living the life of Riley in those hotels. They will be transferred out of the hotels sooner or later. So anybody thinking they're whining and dining on fancy meals in hotels is completely wrong. Fourthly, the cost of refugees in net fiscal terms is going to be negligible and could even work out to be slightly profitable for our country. There's a study referenced by the Adam Smith Institute. This study estimates that refugees pay $21,000 more in taxes than they receive in benefits over the first 20 years in the US. So this is US related, but I don't really see why we can't have similar figures when it comes to the UK vis-a-vis refugees. Although figures are hard to come by, but I'd imagine we'd have a similar setup when it comes to refugees as the US. So why can't we not have similar figures when it comes to net fiscal impact? I'd imagine it's going to be similar. Fifthly, I want to touch on this idea that Britain is being passive or supporting the passage of migrants onto British land. This is all about international law. If a dinghy ends up in British water, it's incumbent on our Coast Guard and on our Navy to escort them to safety. That would be obviously the nearest port, which will be in the UK. In international water or French water, the French Navy do turn some vessels back which they feel are not seaworthy or not strong enough or not robust enough to make that journey over to British water, and thus is too dangerous for them, meaning that they escort them back to French land. I highly suspect the Tory government has done poorly in negotiating with the French. Britain has probably been pressurised by the EU and the French to take more refugees in, hence why there's a continuous flow of them coming through this route. So nobody's really trying to stop it in a serious fashion. Keep that in mind, and it's not going to change regardless of how many times you pop over to Dover and video migrants and whatever. Okay, and how many times you share a grifter ranting about migrant crossers. And do remember who asked you to vote the Tory government? Who were the ones who were telling you to join the Tory party or vote for them? Remember, it was the Zio Civnat grifters. Sixthly, they're not taking your jobs. They're not. The refugees aren't taking your jobs. Those people housed in hotels aren't taking your jobs. Let me tell you what's taking your jobs. Automation and offshoring of jobs, and the recession and the lack of investment by the Conservative government is taking your jobs. There's an anecdotal stat of around 40% of demo goers are unemployed. So people who are shouting the loudest are the ones who we are paying for the most, the people without the jobs. Don't get me wrong, make no mistake, I'm not demonizing the folks without jobs. I'm not targeting unemployed people here. All I'm saying or doing here is pointing out that these demo goers and so-called activists, where around half of them may well be unemployed, they're the ones who scream the loudest about refugees, but they've never raised their voices or even tried to organise a protest against austerity and unemployment, nor have they asked or requested their higher-ups in the Zio Civnat cabal to organise demos against the real strife of austerity and lack of jobs the working class are being crippled by. Of course, Golding, Robinson and Anne-Marie Waters are all about their pockets, not your pockets, and their agendas. The Zio Civnat agendas in the case of Robinson and Anne-Marie Waters. Why would they bother caring about working class folk like yourselves whilst they've got plenty of income themselves? The same applies to folks like Gerard Batten, folks like Nigel Farage. Why aren't they not organising mass demonstrations at Whitehall against austerity and unemployment? They're not. They're misdirecting your attention towards Dover. That's in line with what the Conservative government want you to think, want you to do. They want you to be talking about what's happening in Dover rather than what's affecting you and your children in everyday life. Austerity, the mismanagement of COVID-19 and unemployment. It's an absolute shambles, right? And it just shows these folks, they don't really have your interests at heart. Remember, who asked you to vote for Boris? Who was telling you to vote for Boris? It was folks like Mr. Golding. That guy was even trying to join the party, the Conservative Party, I kid you not. Mr. Robinson was asking you to vote for the Conservatives as well. The Zio Civnats wanted you to vote for Boris and the Conservatives because they were so worried about Corbyn. Some of them would have been concerned that he would not have been acquiescent enough to that state in the Middle East that begins with I, and it's not Iraq and Iran. So who are these people serving? They're not serving the British people. They're serving some other masters. Keep that in mind. It's time for the lot of you to start using your brains and bump up your levels of discernment. You've been taken for a ride. Are you going to get off that ride now and start asking the pressing questions, the key questions? Or are you going to start pointing the fingers where you should start pointing the fingers at? Or are you just going to carry on being used by the establishment and Zio Civnat grifters? I want to refute or address this claim or misconception that all these refugees are young single men. From 2010 to 2018, and again this is Oxford University, 67% of asylum seekers were male. What does that mean? That means 33% would have been female. And given how treacherous those journeys are, you can understand why there's less females, right? But I suspect once the males get permission to stay here, or if they do get that, they try and bring over their wives and kids, or at the very least, they end up grafting and working here and sending remittance back to their families abroad.